They say history is written by the victors. But what happens when the victors are wrong? For centuries, the narrative was controlled by empires that looked at the Philippines and saw only savages waiting to be civilized. They claimed these 7,000 islands were a cultural void, a blank page until the West arrived with their crosses and cannons. But the earth remembers what the books forgot. This is a story of Professor Alistair Sterling, a man who staked his entire reputation on the claim that the Philippines had no true history. And it is a story of the ancient, golden secret buried beneath the jungle floor that rose up to destroy his career, humiliate the establishment, and rewrite the timeline of humanity itself. Buckle up. You are about to witness the moment the history books were set on fire. This story is going to reveal the golden history of Philippines, every lie the British has told the world about them, and the resilient spirit of the Filipino people. So, before we continue, click the subscribe button of this channel now, because when you do that, you will be one of the first people to see our amazing videos immediately it drops. If you have done that, thank you. Let's dive into it. The year was 2024, and the Grand Lecture Hall of Oxford University was filled to capacity, the air thick with the scent of old paper and pretension. At the podium stood Professor Alistair Sterling, a man whose tweed jacket seemed as stiff as his opinions. He was launching his magnum opus, a controversial book titled Islands of Dust, the myth of pre-colonial civilization in the Pacific. With a sneer that was broadcasted on screens behind him, Sterling declared to the gathered academics that the Philippines, prior to Spanish arrival, was nothing more than a collection of scattered tribes with no cohesive culture, no trade, and certainly no history worth recording. They were merely drifting leaves, he announced, his voice dripping with condescension, waiting for the wind of the west to give them direction. The audience applauded politely, unaware that thousands of miles away, the wind was about to change. The clip of Sterling's speech went viral instantly, sparking a firestorm of outrage across social media, particularly in Southeast Asia. But in a small, cluttered office at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, Dr. Maria Santos wasn't typing angry comments. She was packing a bag. Maria was the opposite of Sterling in every way, scrappy, underfunded, and driven by a fire that had been passed down through generations of oral history. She held in her hand not a book, but a crumbling, hand-drawn map left to her by her grandfather, a former treasure hunter in Mindanao. The map didn't lead to Spanish gold or Japanese plunder. It pointed to a location in the Agusan marshlands marked with a symbol that no modern historian recognized, a symbol that predated the arrival of Magellan by at least 1,000 years. Sterling's book tour continued, and with every interview, his claims became more insulting. He appeared on major news networks, dismissing the famous Laguna copperplate inscription as a singular anomaly and the Banao rice terraces as agricultural accidents. He thrived on the controversy, his book sales skyrocketing as he positioned himself as a guardian of objective history. He claimed that without stone temples like Angkor Wat or Borobudur, the Philippines had no claim to greatness. Civilization leaves a footprint in stone, he told a BBC reporter, sipping tea. The Philippines has only left footprints in the mud. Maria watched this interview on her phone while sitting on a cramped bus heading south, her knuckles white as she gripped the device. Just wait, she whispered to the pixelated face of the man insulting her ancestors. Just wait until you see what's in the mud. Arriving in Butuan, Maria met with her team, a ragtag group of graduate students and local Manobo guides who knew the marshes better than they knew their own pockets. They were working on a shoestring budget, funded mostly by Maria's savings and a small grant she had practically begged for. The rainy season was beginning, and the Agusan River was swelling, turning the landscape into a treacherous labyrinth of water and silt. The locals warned them that the area Maria wanted to explore, a submerged cavern system known locally as *Bibiging Buwaya*, the crocodile's mouth, was cursed. They said the spirits there did not welcome strangers. But Maria showed them the symbol on her grandfather's map. The elders went silent. One of them, a man named Tati Lando, looked at her with fear in his eyes. "That is not a map to gold," he said. "That is a map to the Sleeping King." The expedition into the marsh was a nightmare of humidity and leeches. For 3 days, they navigated narrow waterways on motorized bankers, the jungle canopy so thick it blotted out the sun. Morale was low. The students were exhausted, and the equipment was malfunctioning due to the dampness. Every night, around the campfire, they would check their satellite phones and see fresh headlines about Sterling. He was now challenging Filipino historians to a debate in London, a debate he knew they couldn't afford to attend. "They are silent because they have no proof," Sterling tweeted. Maria read the tweet aloud to her team, her voice trembling not with sadness, but with rage. "He thinks silence is emptiness," she told them, sharpening her machete. "He doesn't realize that silence is just a deep breath before the scream." On the fourth day, the sonar equipment on their boat pinged. They were floating over a section of the marsh that was supposed to be just deep mud, but the reading showed a massive, solid structure buried 10 meters beneath the silt. It was a geometric anomaly, perfectly straight lines in a world of organic curves. Excitement replaced exhaustion instantly. They donned their scuba gear, the water murky and brown like coffee. Maria was the first to dive. Visibility was near zero, but as she descended, her flashlight beam hit something that didn't belong in a swamp. It wasn't a rock. It was a pillar, a massive, intricately carved pillar made of obsidian, volcanic glass, which was not native to this specific region. As Maria wiped the silt away from the pillar, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The carvings were exquisite. They weren't crude tribal etchings. They were complex, mathematical reliefs depicting star charts, ocean currents, and massive fleets of ships that looked nothing like the Balangays historians knew. She resurfaced, gasping for air and screaming for the dredging equipment. "It's a gate!" she yelled, pulling her regulator out. "It's not a temple, it's a gate." The team worked frantically for the next 48 hours, battling the currents to clear the entrance. What they found was a sealed entryway, preserved by the anaerobic mud of the marsh. It wasn't just a ruin, it was a time capsule, untouched for millennia. Back in London, Professor Sterling was enjoying a gala dinner in his honor. He was toasted as a man who brought realism back to Pacific history. During his speech, he made a joke about the imaginary kingdoms of the Filipinos, drawing laughter from the tuxedoed crowd. "If they had a civilization," he quipped, raising a glass of champagne, "they must have built it out of dreams, for it has certainly vanished into thin air." At that exact moment, halfway across the world, Maria Santos was breaking the seal on the underwater chamber. As the heavy stone door gave way, a rush of trapped air bubbles escaped, air that had been sealed inside since before the Roman Empire fell. The imaginary kingdom was about to become very real. The chamber was not filled with water. It was an air pocket, a marvel of ancient engineering designed to withstand the floods. Maria and her lead diver, forming a seal with the airlock they had installed, entered the dry space. The air was stale and smelled of ozone and metal. They turned on their heavy-duty floodlights, and the darkness fled, revealing a sight that made Maria drop to her knees. It was a library, but not of paper or bamboo. The walls were lined with thousands of thin, gold sheets, leaves of gold, inscribed with tiny, precise writing. In the center of the room sat a mechanism, a massive globe made of gold and jade, floating in a pool of liquid mercury. Maria approached the golden library with trembling hands. She recognized the script immediately. It was a protoscript, an ancestor to the Baybayin and Kawi scripts, but far more complex. She began to read one of the golden sheets. It wasn't a religious text. It was a logbook, a trade manifest. It listed exports, spices, gold, and steel, and it listed destinations. Her eyes widened as she translated the names of the trading partners. The Kingdom of Cham, the Empire of the Dragon, the Lands of the Sand, and then a reference that made her blood run cold, the Tin Islands of the Far West. They were trading with the British Isle for tin, centuries before the Romans even set foot there. The Philippines wasn't isolated. It was a hub. The team spent the next week documenting everything in absolute secrecy. They knew that if word got out too early, looters would descend, or worse, the government might seize the site and mishandle the artifacts. But the centerpiece, the floating globe, was a true marvel. It was a celestial navigation computer. When Maria touched a specific gemstone on its surface, the globe spun on its mercury base, aligning with the star charts carved on the walls. It showed the night sky exactly as it appeared in 1000 BC. This society had mastered astronomy and global navigation, while Europe was still in the dark ages of tribal warfare. This was a Agusan celestial sphere, and it was undeniable proof of advanced science. But they needed the kill shot, They needed something that would specifically dismantle Sterling's narrative. Maria found it on the seventh day. Tucked away in a ceremonial alcove was a diplomatic gift. It was a heavy, iron sword, but the design was unmistakable. It was a Celtic sword, specifically from the Hallstatt culture of ancient Europe, and wrapped around the hilt was a golden band with an inscription in the ancient Filipino script, "Received from the pale strangers who seek our steel." It was a receipt. The ancestors of the British hadn't discovered the Philippines. They had come as customers. The Filipinos were the advanced manufacturers. The Europeans were the raw material suppliers. The power dynamic was completely reversed. Maria knew she had to go public, but she had to do it on her own terms. She didn't call the Philippine media. She called the international press. She contacted the very network that had aired Sterling's interview and promised him an exclusive that would change history books forever. She demanded a live broadcast from the National Museum in Manila. Meanwhile, Sterling caught wind of a significant find in the Philippines. He dismissed it on Twitter as likely Spanish-era trinkets being exaggerated by local nationalists. He decided to fly to Manila, not to celebrate the discovery, but to personally debunk it on live television. He wanted to crush this hope in person. It was a trap Maria had been praying he would walk into. The day of the reveal arrived. The National Museum was packed. Journalists from the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and the BBC were present. Sterling sat in the front row, looking bored and checking his watch, flanked by his assistants. Maria walked onto the stage. She looked tired, her hands scarred from the excavation, wearing simple field clothes. She didn't look like a polished academic. She looked like a soldier returning from war. She stood behind the podium and didn't say a word. She simply pressed a button. The giant screen behind her lit up with high-definition footage of the underwater chamber, the Hall of Golden Leaves. The crowd gasped. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Sterling stopped checking his watch. He sat up. "Professor Sterling," Maria said, her voice amplified in the stunned silence. "You claim my ancestors were drifting leaves. You claimed we had no history until you brought it to us." She signaled to the stagehands. Two men wheeled out a sealed glass case containing the Celtic sword and the golden receipt. "This is a sword forged by your ancestors, the Hallstatt Celts, roughly 2,800 years ago." Sterling scoffed audibly. "Impossible," he interrupted, standing up. "A Celtic sword in Southeast Asia? It's a plant. A forgery. This is ridiculous." The camera swung to him. This was the confrontation the world wanted to see. Maria didn't back down. "We anticipated your skepticism, Professor. That is why we had the iron analyzed by 3 independent labs in Switzerland, Japan, and the US. The isotopic signature of the iron matches the mines of Austria, consistent with Hallstatt artifacts. But the gold wrapping? That is a Gusen gold. And the craftsmanship of the binding? Distinctly butuancity." She clicked a remote, and the chemical analysis reports flashed on the screen. "Your ancestors didn't bring civilization to us, Professor. They came here to buy it. We were selling high-grade steel to Europe when London was nothing but a swamp." Sterling's face turned a shade of red that matched the carpet. He walked up to the glass case, ignoring protocol. He stared at the sword, his eyes darting frantically, looking for a flaw, a crack, a sign of modern manufacturing. There was none. The corrosion patterns were authentic. The gold inlay was ancient. He turned to the crowd, sweating. Transoceanic contact to that date is scientifically impossible. The navigation technology didn't exist. He was shouting now, losing his composure. "You expect us to believe they crossed 2 oceans? With what? Canoes?" "No," Maria answered calmly. "Not canoes." She signaled again. The lights in the museum dimmed. A hologram projector, funded by the university's engineering department, whirred to life in the center of the room. It projected a 3D scan of the massive, obsidian gate they had found in the marsh and the ships depicted on its relief. "We found the shipyard records in the Golden Library," Maria narrated. "These were double-hulled catamarans, 50 meters long, capable of carrying 200 tons of cargo and sustaining a crew for months. They used the Agusan celestial sphere to navigate by the stars with a precision Europe wouldn't match until the 1700s. The room was silent, save for the hum of the projector and the frantic clicking of camera shutters. Sterling looked like a man watching his own house burn down. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. This changes everything," a reporter from the BBC whispered into her microphone. "If this is verified, the entire timeline of maritime history is wrong." Maria looked at Sterling. "We didn't just have a history, Professor. We had a global empire of trade. The blow was fatal." But Maria wasn't done. She wanted to bury the islands of dust theory so deep it would never resurface. "There is one last thing," she said. She displayed an image of one specific golden leaf from the library. This text describes a great catastrophe, a volcanic eruption that buried the capital and forced the people to flee. It explains why the civilization vanished. It wasn't because we were weak. It was because nature reset the board. She paused, but they left a message for the future, a warning. She looked directly at Sterling. It says, "Guard the truth, for the ignorant from the west will come to steal the sun." The irony hit the room like a physical wave. The ancient texts had predicted men like Sterling. The press conference ended in chaos. Reporters swarmed Maria, ignoring Sterling entirely. The British historian was left standing alone by the glass case, a relic of an obsolete mindset, staring at the sword that proved his life's work was a lie. He tried to slip out the back exit, but the cameramen were ruthless, capturing his defeat in 4K resolution. The headline the next day didn't read "New Discovery in Philippines." It read, "The Empire Strikes Out, How the Philippines Proved Britain Wrong." In the weeks that followed, the Agusan discovery became the most talked about archaeological event since the finding of Tutankhamun's tomb. Universities around the world scrambled to rewrite their textbooks. The Islands of Dust book was pulled from shelves by the publisher, cited for factual inaccuracies. Sterling resigned from his position at Oxford, citing health reasons, and vanished into obscurity. But for the Philippines, the change was spiritual. The discovery didn't just add a chapter to their history, it restored their spine. Children in Manila schools weren't just learning about being colonized anymore. They were learning about being navigators, astronomers, and kings. Maria Santos became a national hero, but she refused the celebrity lifestyle. She returned to the marsh. There was still so much work to do. The Golden Library contained thousands of documents, and they had only translated a fraction. They found records of medicine, of law, of poetry. They found love letters written on gold. They found recipes. They found a culture so vibrant and human that it made the term prehistoric seem like an insult. The site was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected by the military and closed to treasure hunters. Only scholars were allowed, and for the first time, Western scholars had to ask Filipino scholars for permission to enter. One rainy afternoon, months later, Maria was working in the preservation tent when a young girl from the local village approached her. The girl was holding a plastic toy sword, pretending to fight imaginary monsters. She stopped and watched Maria cleaning a piece of ancient jewelry. "Is that magic?" the little girl asked. Maria smiled, wiping sweat from her forehead. "No, a knack, child," Maria said. "It's memory. It's proof that you come from giants." The girl looked at her toy sword, then at the gold. She stood a little taller. "I'm going to find something too one day," the girl declared. "I know you will," Maria replied. The impact of the discovery rippled outward. Other Southeast Asian nations began re-examining their own myths and oral histories. Funding poured into local archaeology. The narrative of the passive native was dead. The world realized that while Europe was building castles, the Pacific was building networks. The age of exploration wasn't a European invention. They were just late to the party. The Pacific Ocean wasn't a barrier to ancient Filipinos. It was a highway, and they drove it better than anyone. A year later, a documentary team arrived to interview Maria. They asked her if she felt vindicated. They asked if she hated Sterling. Maria looked out over the marsh, now calm and peaceful. "I don't hate him," she said. "In a way, I thank him. His arrogance was a shovel that dug up the truth. If he hadn't tried so hard to erase us, I might never have fought so hard to find us." She picked up a replica of the celestial sphere. He wanted to prove we were empty. Instead, he proved we were full. Full of gold, full of stars, full of stories. The documentary aired globally. It ended with a shot of the text on the golden scroll, "Guard the truth." It became a rallying cry for indigenous movements everywhere. The Sterling effect became a term in academia for the bias of Western historians. The Philippines was no longer seen as a victim of history, but as a survivor of it. The Pearl of the Orient wasn't just a pretty name anymore. It was a testament to a civilization that shone brightly even when buried in the dark. Back in England, Alistair Sterling sat in his study, surrounded by unsold copies of his book. He watched the documentary on his laptop. He saw the footage of the Golden Globe spinning, tracking the stars of 1000 BC. He saw the undeniable proof of the Holstatt sword. For the first time in his life, the ego cracked. He wept, not for his career, but for the realization of how blind he had been. He had spent his life studying history, but he had failed to understand humanity. He had looked at a jungle and saw a weed, failing to see the garden that lay beneath. Maria eventually published her own book, The Golden Echo. It wasn't written in academic jargon. It was written for the people. It became a bestseller. She used the proceeds to build a museum in Butuan and a scholarship fund for young Filipino archaeologists. She wanted to ensure that the next time a Sterling came along, there would be 1,000 Marias ready to stand at the gates. She taught them that their history wasn't in a museum in London or Madrid. It was under their feet. It was in their blood. The story of the Philippines is no longer a story of colonization. It is a story of interruption. The golden Tara, the ivory tablet, and now the Ragusan celestial sphere prove that the islands were awake long before the West arrived to wake them up. The sun sets on the Agusan marsh, casting long shadows over the water. The spirits of the ancestors are no longer restless. They have been heard. The British historian was wrong. The Philippines didn't have no asterisk history. It had too much history for small minds to comprehend. And now, finally, the whole world knows the way to the gold in the mud.